Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a tremendous privilege now to introduce Professor Gareth Jones, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Academic and International at the University of Otago in New Zealand, where he's been Professor of Anatomy and Structural Biology since 1983. Before that, he held positions at the University of Western Australia and University College London. He's a visiting fellow at St Edmund's College, Cambridge, and an adjunct professor at Liverpool Hope University. In 2004, he was made a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit, which, if that's as distinguished or equivalent to the British one, it's a pretty incredibly high honour, I must say. He holds the degrees of DSc and MD for his publications in neuroscience and bioethics, respectively. And he's Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Government's Advisory Committee on Assisted Reproductive Technology. He has major research interests in bioethics, particular interests in embryology and in neuroscience. Indeed, he's spoken a number of times at the Faraday on the latter topic, but today it's embryology.
Thank you very much. In a civilized society, there are certain topics which do not discuss. And I think the embryo is one of them. But somehow or other, I've been given this to discuss. And I have to say I do it with a lot of trepidation, because I'm aware that inevitably with a topic like this, that one does touch on some very difficult territory, and undoubtedly one treads on toes. Look, I do not do that deliberately, I can assure you, but I want to see where I can push some of these issues. And I think some of the things that in our two previous talks that we've had indications of these issues around the embryo, I think what I'm going to do is probably just go into them in somewhat more detail. I speak within the Christian tradition because that is where I myself am placed, but I hope that it will apply to those from other religious traditions as well. Is there a place for science and scientists in theological discussions of the status of the human embryo and on the value to be bestowed upon it? Is reassessment actually required? Now, mutually contradictory answers will be given to those questions. For many Christians, reassessment along these lines amounts to little more than compromise of fundamental theological assertions. For many Christians, any move away from the absolute sovereignty and integrity of the human embryo is an attack upon the dignity of all human life. The embryo, many would say, is inviolable and should be shielded from the assaults of scientists and clinicians. And so, they would argue, allow any weakening of this protection, and all human life is demeaned. And so, instead of reassessment of theological approaches, there should be a reassertion of traditional theological stances, and even a strengthening of these stances. In other words, some would argue scientific inroads into the embryonic domain are to be resisted and not accommodated. It's not only those with an overt theological stance who adopt this sort of position. Listen to the Domestic Policy Council of the White House. In a statement issued in January 2007, entitled "Advancing Stem Cell Science Without Destroying Human Life," we find the following. The destruction of embryos for experimental purposes could also open the way to more general and profound manipulations and re-engineering of human life. Without an understanding that life begins at conception and that an embryo is a nascent human being, there will always be arguments that uses, takeovers, and makeovers of embryos are justified by potential scientific and medical benefits. And it continues, crossing this line would needlessly encourage a conflict between science and ethics that can only do damage to both and to our nation as a whole. End of quote. Now, against that background, I want to turn to the issues as I see them. one Christian organization committed to demonstrating the manner in which the Christian faith should be addressing questions of relevance for contemporary society, it has as one of its fundamental tenets that human life is sacred from conception. Now, I think this statement is interesting for a number of reasons. The first is that it's regarded by this organization as foundational for Christian witness in modern society. It appears to be non-negotiable, and one assumes that without it, Christian witness will be muted. Second point is the assurance with which it's propounded. It's true, and by definition, any position deviating from it will not be true. The third point is what the statement actually conveys, and it is the sacredness of human life and its sacredness from its very first glimmerings. Now, one assumes from this that human life is sacred in a way in which all human life is not sacred. But of course we have to ask here, and I'll come back to this a bit later on, what does the claim for sacredness actually mean? Are we sacred, that is, are we holy, are we sacrosanct, in a way in which God is sacred? Or is there a difference? Now, for many Christians, sentiments along these sorts of lines are foundational, and they certainly should be respected. They're foundational for them, since these alone will keep in check the rampant runaway forces of modern science, and in particular, the potentially dehumanizing reproductive technologies. And these are things that have already come up for discussion. We are living on a battlefield where the future of humankind is being fought over. And the sacredness of human life from conception is the one and only weapon we have. These are the sorts of terms in which the concerns are phrased. And I think it's no exaggeration to state that many accept what I'm calling the sacredness-conception combination, or the sacredness-conception duality. And just to keep John Bryant quiet here, I'm using conception here, not fertilization, because I think this is the way in which it's often phrased here. And that sacredness-conception combination seems to be a basic dogma without which all is lost. And so for many, its non-negotiable nature is self-evident. And it readily becomes a mark of faithfulness to Christian fundamentals. And so when confronted by the reproductive technologies, many will argue that the truly Christian response is to question whether we should utilize them at all. Because once that is allowed, we've relinquished our moral and our spiritual authority. So I think it's clear then that the legitimacy of the sacredness-conception combination is critical. Because if it's wrong, or even if it's simply misleading, then the end result could be a marginalizing of Christians as they get caught on the wrong side of a science-faith divide. Some Christians, though, have doubts on these matters, but others have no doubts. But of course others, as we've been hearing, are far from convinced, especially when confronted by some of the dilemmas encountered in real life. But I think regardless of the position we adopt, what we should be struck by is the difficulty and the perplexity of the reproductive area. It will be difficult, it will be perplexing, whatever position we have. And so to the nice, simple question which we've already heard phrased, when does human life begin? And so this is the question so often in people's minds. When does human life begin? And it's already been put this afternoon. To this apparently simple question, many people want an equally simple answer. It's at point X or point Y. Before point X, there's nothing. After point X, there's everything. Or alternatively, before point Y, there is nothing of great moral concern. After point Y, there is something of inestimable value. Now, the pressure to give an answer is usually immense. So much so, I think, that people feel aggrieved when they're not provided with one, even if an answer is one with which they take issue. To refuse to answer such a simple question is seen as obfuscating, as being pig-headed, or a sad indecision of an impoverished thinker? There must be an answer to such an age-old question. And surely anyone in the business of ethics or moral theology has had plenty of time to formulate their position. And by definition, it'll indicate a clear point of demarcation. And for scores of Christians, the correct answer is conception or fertilization. But I refuse to capitulate this easily. When people ask, when does human life begin? What sort of answer do they expect? Are they looking for an answer that is scientific, philosophical, theological, social, or a mixture of all four? As we think about this question, we should also ask ourselves why we are interested in it and in any answer that might emerge. What issues will it help us resolve? How might an answer to this basic question affect the way in which we value and therefore treat embryonic and fetal humans? Might it have ramifications for the way in which we treat children and adults? And in particular, might it influence the way in which we respond to those living, let us say, in numerous African countries today, where even the most basic public health measures and medical therapies are largely unavailable? After all, the humanness of those people is never in doubt. And yet the way in which they live and the way in which they die is light years removed from where we are at. What is the comparative value of a young mother in a village in Ethiopia and an embryo in a fertility clinic in Cambridge? Now, abortion has been the traditional reason behind asking, and I presume answering, the question of when human life begins. And ethical discussions on the reproductive technologies continue to be dominated by abortion. But of course, as we've been hearing, there's a snag, because the emphasis on abortion is on the late embryo and the fetus from 7 to 8 weeks onwards, whereas bioethical discussions on reproductive issues focus on the early embryo, and in particular, as we've been hearing, on the pre-implantation embryo, which of course is up to 14 days post-fertilization, and generally around 3 to 7 days of gestation is what we're interested in. Now, these differences in timing may be of profound ethical and even theological significance, a significance that is completely missed if the discussion commences with the parameters set by abortion. Neither is this of mere theoretical interest, because human embryos have been available for study in the laboratory for almost 40 years. And as soon as this became feasible, they could be assessed for abnormalities, and they could be used for research purposes. And of course, all of these can occur in connection with in vitro fertilization, IVF, and with the studies on the causes of infertility and diseases afflicting embryos. And more recently, as we've been hearing, they've taken us into the realm of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, and the creation of hybrids, chimeras, etc. In other words, what is of paramount significance is the status of the very early embryo, and especially, as we've been hearing, of the blastocyst. And as we've already heard, the blastocyst contains the inner cell mass, some of which cells will ultimately give rise to the new individual, and the external trophectoderm cells, which will give rise to the future placenta and support tissues. Well, the point I'm making is that the status of blastocysts is central to ethical debate, because, again, as we've heard, they are capable of serving as the source of stem cells, etc., etc. We don't need to go into that. But I think there's an additional ethical issue that hasn't featured prominently in ethical or theological debate. And this is whether there is any difference in status between the blastocysts in a woman's uterus and the blastocysts in a laboratory. That is, between in vivo or in utero blastocysts on the one hand and in vitro blastocysts on the other. Is it conceivable that there may be a differential value between these two groups of blastocysts, on the ground that the prospects of developing into a new individual are present in the first group, but absent in the second? And how are they to be valued in comparison with children and adults? The way in which one answers these questions will determine the lengths to which one is prepared to go to protect blastocysts. But let's go a little bit further then in asking what it is we are talking about. When we ask the question, when does human life begin, what are we actually asking? Are we talking about a new human existence in the sense in which a new biological unit has come into play? In other words, is it the same as asking, when does a new dog life become a dog, or a new rat life a rat? I mean, when are they? At the purely biological level, it's self-evident that a new human life begins once the process of fertilization has been completed, give or take a few hours or so. Simply because that is the start of a whole host of processes that, given a supportive environment and minimal abnormalities, will end in an adult organism, whether this be human, dog, or rat. But of course, again, as we've been hearing, even this, taken in isolation of other considerations, doesn't provide a very precise answer, because fertilization itself is a process incorporating a series of important steps. And of course, even here, there's a potential trap, and again, this came up just a short time ago. Development may not commence with fertilization, but with something like somatic cell nuclear transfer or cloning. And cloning may force a restatement of this biological position if human cloning ever really enters the picture. However, one can say that what one is dealing with from at least 1 to 2 days onwards is certainly human tissue. And like all other human tissue, this is to be treated with a degree of moral circumspection beyond that appropriate for non-human tissue. But is a biological answer the one that most people are interested in? And of course, to this question, there's a whole variety of answers given. Because what people are generally concerned with is how much value or protection should be bestowed upon an embryo. And this, of course, is the reason why a distinction between human life and personhood is frequently introduced. A distinction between being human, as with the biological definition, and being a person, when the biological entity should be valued as a human person. Now, what this distinction signifies is that with the recognition of personhood, an individual must be valued and protected exactly as all human persons should be valued and protected. And so by implication, there may be those who are human, but who are not persons in the fullest sense, and therefore don't have the protection that we normally expect to give to persons. And possibly, early embryos fit into this category, especially early embryos in the laboratory. Now, when put like this, it's not surprising that this distinction horrifies some people, on the ground that no human beings should ever be classed as non-persons. For some, not even a newly fertilized egg, let alone a human blastocyst, can be classed as a non-person. All are persons simply because they are human. No additional criteria are needed. Now, for many Christians, the distinction between humans as biological entities and humans as persons devalues human life, because a newly fertilized egg and a blastocyst are as morally significant as are any of us. They also fear that this distinction may lead to a situation whereby fetuses, the mentally retarded and the demented, will also be demoted to a non-personal status and will be regarded as disposable. Now, some Christians also make the theological point that since all humans are made in the image and likeness of God, it is not possible to conclude that any humans are worth less than any other humans. Hence, since the earliest of human embryos are made in God's image, they must be given total protection. If God loves them, so must we. And so under no circumstances should research be conducted on any human embryos, unless it's for the benefit of those particular embryos. To claim to love an embryo, but then carry out destructive research on it, is seen as a contradiction in terms. Now, in arguing like this, they're placing the earliest of embryos on precisely the same footing as every other human being, on the basis of God's love for them. They are full members of the human community, the assumption being our love of persons like us and our love of blastocysts is of the same kind. Now, of course, as with every other issue in this early developmental area, theological statements like this raise queries of their own. How do we know that God loves every embryo? And what does God's love for blastocysts actually mean? Did Christ die for every blastocyst, including the 70 to 80% of all blastocysts that are biologically incapable of developing beyond 2 to 3 weeks gestation because of, again as we've heard, various inbuilt abnormalities? And if so, what does that mean, and how do we know? And similarly, what does the image of God mean in the case of blastocysts, both those capable of developing further and those incapable of doing so? Now you see, on the surface, these questions give the appearance of being worthlessly erudite, the sort of thing that academics who've got nothing better to do spend their time thinking about. And of course, the important thing is they appear to be far removed from everyday reality. And yet, of course, they're not. When confronted by decisions about undertaking IVF, carrying out PGD, or conducting research on human embryos, answers to questions like these have to be given, if it's thought that the questions themselves are meaningful. And of course, for some people, the answers may be shocking, because one could conclude that blastocysts as a whole, or even certain groups of blastocysts, are not the specific objects of God's love and are not made in God's image. Now, this is a daily issue for those working in fertility clinics, where decisions are being made about which embryos to implant in a woman undergoing IVF. Some are considered to be viable and some non-viable. Very crude distinction, that's the best we have these today. If both groups, the viable and the non-viable, or the viable and possibly viable or non-viable, if both groups are regarded as imaging God, is there a moral and spiritual obligation to implant non-viable as well as viable embryos, on the ground that this obligation entails doing everything possible to actualize the potential for life, even when the possibility of success is exceedingly remote? Of course, my emphasis so far has been on either or perspectives. But of course, again as we've already heard, there are alternative positions that view embryos and fetuses as increasing in worth as biological and personal development unfolds, and perhaps also in theological terms, growing into the image of God. Now those sorts of positions, of which there are many variations, they attempt to take seriously the biological phenomena that characterize the growing embryo, including the emergence of things like well-defined organization and individuality, and of course a decrease in the potential of the embryo cells to be redirected. There is a sense of a coming into being along the continuum that marks embryonic development. Now, I think that these alternatives raise very important issues, and I think they encompass a whole range of positions that one is likely to encounter. But I'm not really going to take them really much further in this particular lecture. So I want to park those now and touch again on environmental and community considerations. And again, one or two of these points have already come up in other discussions. One of the characteristics of so much debate on the status of early embryos has been that they are usually viewed as isolated and essentially self-contained entities. Their status, whatever it might be, is inherent to them. And they have this status regardless of where they are encountered, whether it's in a woman's uterine tubes, in a woman's uterus, embedded in the uterine wall, in a woman's abdominal cavity, as in an ectopic pregnancy, in a petri dish in the laboratory, or in a laboratory freezer. For some, they are human persons in all of these locations, even though they lack the potential to become fully developed persons in a number of them. In other words, this perspective takes no account of the embryo's environment. Neither does it take any account of the human community within which the embryos are encountered. Now, whatever we think in this area, I think the one thing is self-evident. And this is that human embryos never exist in isolation of others, even in the laboratory. And it can be argued that they should always be viewed within the context of the human community. Their existence is dependent upon others within this community and on the relationships that they have with them, with others. Now, of course, that observation elicits two quite different responses. One response is to argue that since they are the weakest of all human forms, they should be protected under all circumstances. Their dependence upon other human beings is the crucial ethical and theological driver, and that leads to opposition to their use in any research or therapeutic projects. An alternative response, though, is to assess the worth of very early embryos alongside that of other human beings. It's a comparative worth. But of course, once the claim of comparative worth, as opposed to absolute worth, is made, then the whole tenor of ethical and theological discussion changes. This is because what then comes to the fore are the relationships within the human community. And the spotlight is then directed onto human decision-making, human responsibility, and human control. So the question is, how does this affect the embryo's standing as one who potentially at least images God? Blastocysts are found naturally as well as artificially in a range of environments, as we've seen, some of which enhance their ontogenetic development, others hinder it. In other words, some blastocysts possess the inherent as well as the environmental potential to become flourishing individuals. Others lack this potential on one or other score. Now that, of course, is a biological observation, but I think it introduces theological considerations. Does talk about the image of God also involve environmental considerations, in that it refers to blastocysts plus conducive environment rather than blastocyst alone? If we argue that a blastocyst with no potential for further development images God, it seems to me that we are in effect claiming that all human tissue images God. Is that what we mean to claim? And then what about conflict situations, such as the choice between disposing of an embryo or using it for research or therapeutic purposes? The conflict is between obtaining, say, stem cells from early embryos, which are surplus to the requirements of a couple in an IVF program, compared to routinely disposing of those embryos. Which might be the better path? Now, the frequently encountered response in many Christian circles is that surplus embryos should never have been produced, and therefore, of course, the conflict is bypassed. Now, there's no doubt that represents a particular ideal, and I think it's a valid ideal. But of course, numerous surplus embryos do exist in our societies. And so what's to be done with these embryos simply can't be ignored. They're not going to disappear. And these are, I think, exceedingly demanding and tantalizing questions. And of course, their newness adds to their problematic nature. But I think one thing is sure. Well, we can certainly be sure of one thing. there can be no escape from this intense spotlight on the human embryo. However much we might wish to skirt around the embryonic impasse, and I have to say, I would love to be able to do that, but I think we get dragged back to it time and time again. And you see, for many writers, there are only two options: complete protection for the embryo or no protection at all. And I want to develop this a little bit further, because I think it is something which is very important in discussions, certainly theological discussions. Now, Pope John Paul II, in the Gospel of Life in 1995, stated, "The human being is to be respected and treated as a person from the moment of conception. And therefore, from that same moment, his rights as a person must be recognized, among which, in the first place, is the inviolable right of every innocent human being to life." Now, in line with this, Norman Ford, who's an Australian Roman Catholic ethicist, who's written a couple of major books here, but I'm actually going to quote him from a very recent article he wrote. Because if some of you have written the books, have read the books, you might think that the position is not an accurate reflection of his, but I'm quoting from a very recent article of his. Now, Norman Ford argues that a spiritual soul is required to render human nature rational, and that because the fetus is a living being with a rational human nature, a spiritual soul is created within the embryo at the very beginning of each human existence. And so for Ford, an immaterial soul cannot be derived from matter, and therefore must be created at the inception of an individual's life. And so, once an individual with a rational human nature is formed, it's at that point that human personhood begins. And so, he writes, embryos are as much persons as are children and the severely retarded. And considerations like the development of the brain and the nervous system as the basis of self-consciousness, they are irrelevant. Now, the foundation for this stance is to be found in the writings of Aristotle and Aquinas, with their claim that intellectual acts require an immaterial soul or a life principle. For Ford, the moral significance of the human embryo is based on the existence and the meaningfulness of a non-material reality. In his words, and I quote, "The traditional concept is based on the ontological constitution of a person who is a subject of moral inviolability." End of quote. And so it follows then that there is no place for consideration of scientific perspectives within their with all their developmental insights. Now, over against this approach, Ford places what he describes as the contemporary secular concept, with its focus on the ability of human beings to have rationally self-conscious acts and interests. And of course, as a secular concept, which is well known from the writing of philosophers like Tooley, Singer, and Lockwood. And these are the ones that Ford quotes as giving the only alternative to his position. And of course, for philosophers like this, identity as a human being depends upon a capacity for consciousness. In turn, that requires a sufficient level of functioning of the brain. So you see, while in a sense I think that's correct, but Ford allows for no intermediary position between that particular extreme and the traditional one that he enunciates. And so we end up then with a stark contrast. On one hand, we must grant absolute moral value to the earliest of embryos, even when there's no hint of any function, because they represent the substance of a continuing person with a soul. The alternative position is to grant moral value only in the very later stages of gestation, and if then, when a minimal degree of rationally self-conscious activity capable of expressing interests or desires becomes evident. So he is arguing there is no intermediate position. That's one point of view, but I just want to quote you another one, which is totally different. It's not one with a religious basis at all. very similar conclusions have been reached using this different approach by Robert George and Christopher Tollefson in their recent book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. And again, for them, the middle ground is nothing more than quicksand. More importantly, though, they claim to base their position entirely on science by locating humanity in a biological program rather than in a soul. This program, they argue, with its DNA and its epigenetic factors, is oriented towards developing a brain, and it commences at fertilization. As a result, personhood must also commence at fertilization. And so they oppose the production of spare IVF embryos and any research that would pose a risk to an embryo's health. What's interesting is that for both these writers, modern embryology and human developmental biology established categorically that human embryos are wholes and not simply parts. I do also have to say, though, that neither of them is a scientist. And so, for them, and using their language, embryos are what they call determinate individuals. It's individuals that endure throughout the developmental process before and after birth. So what they argue is that the individuals we are as adults are the same organisms as when we were embryos. So if we claim that adults are to be protected, so must embryos be protected, because there's a continuum between the two. And George and Tollefson, they reject all critiques of their position based on things like twinning, etc., etc. For them, the developmental program trumps all. Now, what's interesting is that these authors claim to be relying entirely on physical scientific data. Yet I think there's a metaphysical element to their claims. After all, what is the relationship between a developmental program and the moral value we place upon that program? And is the developmental program of the embryo as neatly separated from the maternal aspect of that program as they assume? Not only this, I think the developmental substratum of the program manifests itself through gradual unfolding and through numerous transitional features as the embryo makes its way towards greater individuality and in increasing separation from the mother, and of course with the placenta eventually being dispensed with. Now, underlying the position then of George and Tollefson is an assumption that there is no relationship between biological development and increasing moral clarity. An assumption that I think has been injected into their interpretation of the embryology. So ultimately, I think that their absoluteness is far removed from the tentativeness of scientific understanding. Well, with those as a background, and remember, both the positions that I've mentioned simply say there are two positions. There's no intermediate one. Let me now sort of turn and say, well, what about any biblical testimony on the significance of the embryo? Does it point us categorically in the direction of these either-or positions? Or does it provide a helpful way through the morass of competing claims and counterclaims in this whole realm? Now, of course, again, as we've already heard, we can be sure of certainly one thing. There is no way in which the biblical writers could give the specific answers to the type of questions with which we are confronted. The Bible will not specifically map out the significance of fertilization any more than it maps out the significance of blastocysts in the laboratory. But I think there are general principles that stem in large part from the incarnation, when Jesus revealed the image of God in human form and so demonstrated the importance of bodily existence. And I think these principles help lay the groundwork for our thinking about human beings. They are that we're created in God's image, humans are precious to God, they have a special status, however that's expressed, they are to be treated with dignity because this stems from God's love and concern for them, and they're to be respected. Now, and obviously one could think of more. Now, obviously these themes are extremely general, but I think they are foundational, because I think they constitute important guideposts for all our thinking about the ways in which human beings are to be treated. And I think these themes impart to all humans a splendor and a significance that we should never overlook, whether this be in reproductive ethics, or in numerous aspects of social policy, or in international relations. Because they point towards things like equality, compassion, and protection, and away from inequality, exploitation, and social program. Where does this leave life before birth? Well, before I try to answer that question, I just want to note 2 points, both very contentious points. The first is that we don't have reference to the imparting of an immaterial soul into human life, a soul that stands apart from the body. Humans are able to relate to God in a way in which other created beings are not able to do so. But this is as embodied individuals or embodied persons, not as disembodied souls. And so from this it follows that I see no need to ask when a soul is infused into the developing embryo. For me, personally, that's a non-issue. The second point, and I realize that I'm going against what a number of people have already said here, I'm also wary of referring to the sacredness of human life, as if this is a stronger designation than the dignity of human life, or the desire to place very considerable value on human life. It seems to me that use of the term sacred seems to elevate humans to godlike status and to place too great a burden on our ethical systems. But of course, if I don't use that term, this is not to denigrate human existence at all. But it does aim to treat both us and others realistically and honestly. Now, again thinking of references to prenatal human existence in the passages of the Bible, and I'm not going to go into any of these, but you've got them down there. It seems to me what we get out of these sorts of passages is that prenatal humans emerge as part of the human community. Therefore, they are to be viewed as special to us and to God. Human life is also in a few places referred to as a gift of God. Now, as we look at passages like this, I think amongst other things, they reveal the testimonies of a very small number of people about the way in which God had led them and looked after them. These tend to be personal and private confessions about God and his purposes for them. And I think they are far removed from the aseptic clinical world of the reproductive technologies, or the equally aseptic world of academic discussions on the moral status of embryos and fetuses. The closest we come to this today are individuals testifying to God's dealings with them throughout their lives. And I think these can be exact parallels to some of these Old Testament confessions. These biblical passages touch on prenatal life, I think, as confessions about God and his purposes. Now, if I think about myself, and each of us can do this about ourselves, I think it's in this sense that my life is a gift from God. And I'm grateful to God for the gift of human life and the opportunity for me to experience all that human life has to offer. And as I look back, I'm able to exclaim that God has protected me throughout the whole of my physical existence, from the earliest stages of gestation through to the present day. But I think enormous care has to be exercised in moving from such important theological statements about me and for me, and contemporary reproductive issues. Because I think the worlds and the interests are quite different. For instance, what does it mean for me to claim that God knew me before my genetic blueprint was in place? Before there was even the merest hint that an individual with my genetic characteristics would be born? In no sense, it seems, is it meaningful to talk about God's purposes for me 200 years ago. Now, that's not to deny that God did know me well before I ever came to be, nor that he's had purposes for my life. But I think it's presumptuous to link these to any specific genetic, let alone epigenetic features that have laid the basis for what I am as a biological individual. So what I'm saying then is that the move from such personal expressions of praise by God's people to an understanding of how God views all embryos and fetuses represents a seismic shift from the particular to the general, from confessions about God's activities in the lives of particular individuals to statements about how everyone should view embryos en masse. In my estimation, God's protection for David's embryo doesn't justify the assertion that he expects contemporary societies to protect every embryo brought into existence. Perhaps the latter should be the case, but if it is, it has to be argued on other grounds. So the furthest that I think we can go is to state that God is concerned about embryos and fetuses, just as he is concerned about human life after birth. And this is where the general principles of special status, dignity, and respect enter the picture. What this leads to is a serious commitment to the welfare of embryos and fetuses. And while that might sound uninteresting, it ensures that we never treat human life before birth frivolously, and that we never underestimate the worth of those who may be like us in the future. The population of embryos is an important population, just as is the postnatal population. If we argue that embryos are not always of equal importance to the postnatal population, we still have to say that there is at least partial equivalence, and that there are interrelationships that we dare not overlook. And so then, it seems to me we are to extend neighbour love to prenatal human life, and we are to value prenatal human life. Now, of course, one of the striking features of the biblical writings is that they leave a great deal unsaid, things that would be of interest to us today. Passages like the ones that I've just very briefly touched on provide few clues about the significance of determining precisely when human life begins, because the biblical writers, of course, didn't think in those terms, and they didn't address the question of whether a very early embryo is a person with the rights of a person. The writers, I don't think, were interested in questions like those, and even if they had been, they didn't possess the tools to formulate concepts that are routinely accepted today. So what I think emerges from this is that problems like the treatment of blastocysts are our problems. It is our responsibility to decide what response is appropriate for those seeking to be faithful to God. How then, coming to my final area, then do we try and work these things out? The problem of working prospectively. The biblical passage about David and Jeremiah suggests that we can work retrospectively. Looking back, we can make statements about God's care and protection of us. But can we move prospectively? We know that it's impossible to protect all embryos, all early embryos, because vast numbers are lost naturally. But can we say that this early embryo is to be protected as opposed to that early embryo? That, of course, is a question with probably no relevance under normal circumstances during normal pregnancy. Even, of course, when decisions are being made about abortion and then you're dealing with fetuses. But it is relevant when dealing with early embryos in a laboratory situation, where decisions have to be made between embryos on the basis of their viability, or on whether they are or are not carrying particular deleterious genes or whatever. As the focus falls onto these specific embryos, can we say that the knowledge and the care of God apply to some of these, but not to others? Do we then possess theological insights on specific blastocysts? I don't believe we do. Even those who argue that every blastocyst must be preserved have no inside knowledge on each one. Their position is governed by a belief that all human life is sacred and must be preserved. And that, of course, is a commitment to conserve the whole of the embryonic population. But that position doesn't enable choices to be made between blastocysts in a clinical situation where responsible human decision-making demands choices. what if blastocysts are a gift of God? If they represent the gift of new life, and if choices are being made between them, only some blastocysts will experience this gift. That's true. But of course that also applies routinely in natural fertilization and development, where many embryos are lost. So to me anyway, this suggests that to equate each blastocyst with a new human life and gift of God is premature. We simply don't know at this early stage of development whether a meaningful new human life has come into existence. There's no doubt, of course, human tissue is present. But is a blastocyst more than that, especially when in vitro blastocysts still have to be placed in a woman's uterus to mature into human individuals? Now these queries point in the same direction as those who regard 14 days gestation, or even more, as a biologically and theologically significant transition into a discernible new human life. For instance, Shannon and Walter are adamant that one cannot speak of the existence of an individual until about 3 weeks into development, when individualization has occurred. They claim that before that time, the pre-implantation embryo represents what is common to humanity. And they consider that pre-implantation embryos have a pre-moral value in that they are living, they bear the human genome, and they have a teleology directed to the category of personhood. Now, it's not my intention to justify or otherwise or to critique that particular position, but I do agree with them on the lack of clarity of the first few days of development. And then for Ted Peters, dignity is first conferred and later claimed. What he argues is that having been conferred by God, it is we who claim it by conferring it on one another, including on embryos. And Peters argues that dignity ultimately depends on God's love and is relational in character. We confer dignity on an embryo as a gesture of hope, knowing what it may ultimately become, but we don't seek its significance on the basis of its genetic origin. And Peters recognizes the centrality of choice in deciding what should or shouldn't be done to pre-implantation embryos. Manipulating embryos. Does this then suggest we can do anything we like with early embryos? I suggest that we certainly cannot, because it's the nature of the decision-making that is crucial. The choices are serious clinical choices between blastocysts capable of developing further and those incapable of doing so, between blastocysts that will likely develop into healthy individuals and those that will not. Even the use of blastocysts in research, if that's going to occur, that should be governed by a serious therapeutic rationale and the well-grounded hope that it will lead to an improvement in the welfare of individuals and the community. In my view, it's here that we should be directing serious theological reflection rather than at whether blastocysts should ever be used at all. And I think an additional criterion is that any use of human embryo should always be a last resort and should not be used as long as there remain viable alternatives. Any research endeavours should also be assessed within the broader framework of the legitimacy of the science itself. And we have to ask in this context whether we as societies are becoming too dependent upon technological inroads into reproduction. Are we becoming obsessed with biological normality? Now, those sort of questions don't presuppose particular answers, but they do serve, I think, to make us very cautious of technological imperialism. And so I think it's important that we make explicit the implications of what it is we are doing. If human embryos are destroyed, either clinically or in research, the assumption is being made that these particular embryos are not made in the image of God, and that God does not have a special love for them. If that assumption is incorrect, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. But I think this is a far from novel situation, because numerous embryos are lost in all forms of reproduction. And in practice, it is the embryos that go on to become babies that we most revere, and not the extremely early embryos that unknowingly succumb. In IVF, most of the surplus embryos no longer required for reproductive purposes are eventually destroyed, suggesting that they are valued less highly than those that are now children. While the latter, the children, image God, what about those that end up surplus to requirements? Now, you might think that these questions have a bizarre quality to them. And I think they do, because they're employing terminology usually reserved for children and adults. And of course, this may suggest that the concept of being in the image of God doesn't apply to early embryos, and that to think in these terms is unhelpful. I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm just putting it out as a possibility. Can we then go back? Of course, the issues that are emerging here appall some people, and I can see why. They appall them because from their perspective, we shouldn't be in this situation at all. We should return to a former time when these intrusions into the reproductive sphere didn't exist. And I think it's true to say that a more traditional perspective has been to err on the side of caution. Since early embryos may be full human persons, they should be protected and never exploited. And so they should be neither studied nor treated in any way that might jeopardize their best interests. Stassen and Gushee consider that it is better to attribute too much personhood to the fetus, or to the embryo, than too little. It's better to err on the cautious side and include more rather than less within the human community. Now that, you might say, is a conservative stance, but I think it's being driven by highly laudable sentiments. But is it an inherently Christian one? While it's a possible position for Christians, I have no doubt about that, it's not the only conclusion to be drawn from the general biblical and theological principles to which I've referred. It also ensures, I think, that a Christian contribution to think in this area will be eliminated or at least severely circumscribed, because debate on the criteria to be employed in clinical and research procedures may well proceed without any Christian input. It also, of course, has repercussions in clinical practice, where many procedures involve the destruction of early embryos, or at least they rely on research using embryos. After all, you can look at things from post-fertilization contraception and IVF to attempts to understand and treat the causes of infertility. And then further afield, the entire scientific basis of embryology, that's integral to all the language and concepts that we are using, all stems from studies of early embryos over very many years. Now, in the eyes of some, this type of study jeopardizes the dignity of those particular embryos. And I think the consequences are well illustrated by another Christian writer, Hui. And he rejects all the artificial reproductive technologies and artificial contraceptives. He argues that these technologies ask God to accept the child when he hasn't given that gift of life. Now, the sort of comments here don't invalidate this stance, but I think they begin to show the choices that are being made, because choices are inevitable. By assuming that every embryo is a human person and a full member of the human community, other members of that community, including possibly other embryos, will be deprived of access to therapies and procedures that may otherwise have been made available to them. Once again, of course you can justify that position. I have no doubt about that. My position is that this assumption about embryonic status has consequences for the wider human community, and I think for many facets of social policy. And so finally, between certainties and uncertainties. Everything that I've been talking about has been at the borders of what might be described as certainties and uncertainties. They refer, respectively, certainties to areas where we definitely know how we should act, but also to those where there is considerable doubt. Now, that might sound very unsatisfactory, but I think it's a familiar position for those who are right on biomedical issues. The challenge for us is to achieve a balanced perspective of all border issues, especially as they relate to core certainties. For instance, there is much about embryonic life that we do not know. But we do know that embryos are more important than easily replaceable human tissues like skin and mucosa. because they have a potential to become like one of us. On the other hand, embryos are neither theologically nor ethically more important than children and adults. And so human embryos shouldn't dominate our thinking to the exclusion of everyone else. It's a balance then to be attained between things like maleficence and beneficence. And wisdom lies in determining this balance. Wisdom that should inform everything from theological reflection through to a society's policies. My contention is that whatever specific decisions are made, the Christian ethos is to see people in their wholeness and to treat them accordingly. And this, I think, is where respect, dignity, and preciousness in God's sight becomes operative for all humans, not simply for any one group at the expense of other groups. There won't be simple answers. We have to be prepared to live alongside those who will adopt quite a different perspective from our own. And so I think it's in this context that it's useful to bear in mind the words of the preacher in Ecclesiastes 11:5. Just as you do not know how the breath comes to the bones in the mother's womb, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. I think what I'm saying then is that we live in the midst of uncertainties, and on so many occasions our insights into the work of God are deficient. Balancing the welfare and the aspirations of competing groups is far from easy. It requires discernment, wisdom, and a willingness to go on learning in an ever-changing world. And of one thing we can be absolutely certain: the perplexity of our beginnings is going to increase rather than decrease. And I think that's been inherent and implicit in some of the things that people have been saying. They haven't put it in quite those terms. But the issues that we are confronting here are going to get more difficult and not less difficult. And I think there is no way of avoiding this. So there are a few challenges ahead for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that careful analysis. Questions? There must be questions. Yeah.
Just initially, with Ford's position that fertilisation is the beginning of personhood, you mentioned that George and Tolleson rejected the idea that twinning undermines this, but that seems like quite a serious objection to that position, that an embryo can become two persons. So how do you say that it's one person at that stage?
Well, that's not my position.
Well, no, I know, but I mean,
in passing, that this is of course, a criticism that has been made against them, as of course it is, against sort of all positions like this. There are whole lots of arguments here as to exactly whether you are dealing with two persons or not. I mean, the tradition, yes, the straightforward argument against it has been that if you start off with one embryo, it becomes two. Then could you ever have had a unity at the beginning? And how do you know that you had an individual? On the other hand, you can argue, well, you've now got two, therefore the two are important and not just the one. I mean, I don't want to argue this one way or, or the other. I don't think it's a shoot-down argument against any position myself. But it certainly has been seen as being an argument against the significance from conception. I'm not a necessity convinced myself that twinning itself is an argument in that way.
When Gareth made comments about it, I think I very strongly agree with your own conclusion. I think the academic consensus among philosophers in this area is that what was once thought to be an important point about splitting up to age 14 days or so on is morally irrelevant. And the argument that reaches that conclusion is twofold. Imagine a species in which at the age of about 10 years, some individuals split into two and some didn't, but there was no obvious way of knowing in advance which they were. Would you have some different moral status, either for those who did split into two and those who didn't, or for before 10 years and after 10 years of age? And the answer to both questions is no. Secondly, if you think of countries splitting in two, which happens a lot, both in law, but it happens a lot, both the laws to do with how one deals with countries and complete political philosophy and common sense shows that it's not terribly relevant in most ways. So the splitting argument has been abandoned in the academic community.
Very helpful, thank you. Another question? Philippa.
When you were looking at the theological arguments, one of the ones that is often used, and a key argument that's made, which is really mentioned, was the incarnation of Jesus, the way that he came into the world. And obviously it's argued that that's the manner that he came in, that his life began not at birth. It says in the Bible that he was conceived, therefore, and it then later says in Hebrews that we are like him in every way. It's a strong argument that we use to say, well, if Jesus Christ came into the world at the point of conception, and his embryonic life was clearly human life, and clearly of a value at that point, it wasn't that it wasn't on birth. And if we are like that, then that would strongly imply, again, well, I would suggest that it would imply that the embryo, based on the incarnation, has an equal worth as a good at birth and as a Jesus child.
I was wondering the same thing, actually. I wonder if you could paraphrase John 1:14 and the word became a blastocyst. I mean,
on the one hand, yes, I think that does show the importance of embryonic life. I have no doubt whatsoever about that. But this argument always, though, I get some difficulty with it in the end, because of course Jesus didn't come into birth, wasn't fertilized in the normal sort of way. So if Jesus is taken as the example from fertilization onwards, then it is saying that he was different from all of us, or we are all different from him, and certainly all embryos are different from him. And so I wouldn't push it too far. I would certainly say that embryonic life is important, and I think the incarnation does show us that. I have no doubt about that. But I think if we start pushing it to fertilization, I think we've got real problems.
It's called conception, isn't it? In the
Conception. But is conception the same as fertilization?
It is clearly unique, right?
Of course, yes, it's unique. Yeah. It's a bit like saying, well, an argument against abortion in this case is the one of Beethoven, and all the things that were wrong with him, and if he'd been aborted, etc., etc. But he wasn't. And so, in a way, that takes us so far, but no further. And I think we've still got to come back to the issue of saying, well, how do we deal with abortion in that case? How do we deal with embryos? That is still the issue that we always have to deal with.
Michael again.
That's slightly unfair question because it's a yes or no one, which you don't have to respond to yes or no. But is it fair to say that until the last 100 years or so, the history of the church's reasoning in this area has been such entirely consonant with a gradualist position of ensoulment, quickening, and so forth? And is it also the case that in every single country in the world, it has always been the case that there has been a gradually increasing valuing of life during pregnancy as indicated by legal codes for the way in which you deal with harmed pregnant women at various stages of pregnancy, and whether you are harming one person or two?
Yes. Now, of course, and this, I think, is encouraging. And look, and there's absolutely no doubt that there are. I don't like using the term schizophrenic because I'm always thinking sort of neuroscientific terms, but we have, I think, schizophrenic problems within society as to how we deal with prenatal life, human life. Of course, what you've got in the abortion area doesn't make sense compared to what the sort of debates that you got over the very early embryo, and vice versa. clearly there is sort of no ethical, theological, moral consistency in these areas, which we should be deeply concerned about. And that's absolutely right. You know, so I think the contribution, as I see, is to try and bring these things out into the open and try and make people see that there is a relationship between the ways in which we deal with human life at all stages, whether it is early, very early embryonic development, some later fetal life, and of course so many aspects of postnatal life and the inequalities that we've got across the world afterwards, which are horrendous. I mean, and that's why, you know, I threw in at some point, you know, what in the sense, in the terms of way in which we deal, in which we look on human beings, the relationship between a young mother in a village, a remote village in Ethiopia, and embryos in fertility clinics in Cambridge. I mean, I'm not saying that one's more important than the other, but both are important in different contexts. And we've got to try and pull them together in terms of our ethical approaches.
I followed a course in school papers a year or so ago, and one of the issues that I came to conclusion was, following on from this, it wasn't just, following on my, I think my way, was this development of the value. It isn't just the law in a lot of cases. The church historically has placed different value on human life in various stages, even to the point of if life begins at conception, then how is it that we deny stillborn children, or we used to deny stillborn children funerals, Christian funerals, and so we, as a church, as the Christian church at various stages, we've placed a different, varying value on that life. Now, I'm saying we can fix it. I'm not, and this is an issue that we have to address, because if we make a stance that life begins at a point, then we have to offer the same sort of pastoral care and pastoral support of life for all that continuum, not just a breathing individual at 9 months.
Funnily enough, I've actually taken 2 funerals for stillborn babies. So,
yes.
It's something that we do nowadays, but we probably didn't used to do.
But I think our understanding and appreciation of many things is changing, and hopefully in some of these areas it's actually improving. I'm not saying it is in all areas, but I think particularly in that one. Yes, it is an appreciation that the loss is a vast loss, a loss which might be felt very, very deeply indeed by the mother and others, and it's a legitimate feeling of loss, and I think that's something we've learnt. And I think, you know, as we look at how we, church, whoever it might be, has responded in the past to some of these things, we have a huge amount to learn. We've made mistakes, and undoubtedly we are making mistakes now. But I think, you know, that wherever we place the beginning of human life, human person, etc., we have got to be, whatever answer we give to that sort of question, and however we answer it, it has got to be a realistic answer. That then, once we do that, we are in a position to protect all those from this time on, whatever that might be, and that it's something which our laws, etc., are able to protect in meaningful ways, rather than just being theoretical and very idealistic.
Chancellor.
Is it possible to initiate a global ethical forum, maybe under the auspices of UN, to deal with such issues? Like, for instance, in South Asia, you may know that female babies are killed while they are in their mother's womb, So, because in India, the female children means dowry issues, and so they are being killed in a vast number. So I think there must be a global forum, and not only Christian ones, so that we can deal with such issues from a...
Well, I mean, there are attempts to do this. I mean, there are things through UNESCO and etc., etc. And I mean, there certainly probably are many instances where certain bioethical communities are attempting to put pressure on certain governments to come into line on some of these very, very important fundamental issues. So this is happening. And some people talk about a universal bioethics. Now, I'm not sure that I necessarily buy in exactly to that, but what they're trying to say is that there are underlying ethical principles which apply across all societies, all religious traditions, etc. I mean, these are very general ones, but they probably are the ones, like the ones you're touching, which are extremely important. So I think, yes, it is important to get as much pressure, dialogue, discussion going on, and this is happening.
Neil.
Gareth, I'm trying to formulate a question about your discussion of the biblical texts and their significance, and I'm struggling to formulate it clearly in my own mind, so I don't know how clearly the question will come out, but here goes, and we'll see what happens. You showed very clearly, and I think quite rightly, that there just isn't a clear answer to be had from the biblical texts about the moral status of the human embryo, and that shouldn't surprise us at all. I mean, you said quite rightly that this is simply not a question that that either was or could have been a preoccupation of the authors of those texts. You suggested that there are limited inferences that can be drawn. You know, in the cases of the individuals who reflect on, you know, God's care of them even before their birth. That's a reflection of an individual's experience of God's providence. But you said it's presumptuous to generalise from that to statements about the, you know, as it were, God's relationship to all embryonic or fetal life. I think I agree with you on that, at least up to a point. But I think what you then did was to infer from that therefore there's no general sort of biblical prohibition, as it were, on using embryos in ways that, as you also rightly said, rely on the assumption that they don't have particularly special moral status. So the question I'm wanting to ask is, if it's presumptuous to draw the one kind of inference from the things the biblical texts do and don't say, why isn't it presumptuous to draw the other kind of inference? In other words, what I'm wondering is whether you're working with an assumption that the default setting is that early embryos aren't deserving of a high level of protection, and therefore that, you know, if we can't find anything in the biblical text that contradicts that, then we stay with that default assumption. But I think I'm questioning why that is the default assumption.
I would say that sorry.
I think we'll make this the last question, actually.
I would say that the assumption that the place that I would get to is that what one, I think, gets from the biblical writers is that they do place a high view on prenatal human life. Now, what does one mean by that? What might they have meant by it? And that, I think, I don't know. I think what I would say is that I don't see evidence that they placed an absolute value on prenatal human life, but they certainly took it extremely seriously, and protection rather than exploitation is the order of the day. So I think that is the sort of generalization that I would get, or that I am making. But it is to place a considerable value on prenatal human life. But it's not a necessity then that every single embryo has to be protected under every single circumstance, which I think is not possible anyway. So I'm not trying to downplay the value of prenatal human life at all. I am giving it considerable value, and that would be at all stages. I'm not saying, of course, the next step whether or not it's increasing in value, which I would also say, but I've been not touching on that now. So I am placing, and I think, considerable value on prenatal human life, but not absolute value. I don't think you can get the absolute value out of the biblical writers, but I think you can get the importance of prenatal human life.